If I was starting melodic bass production from scratch today, knowing everything that I've learned over the last 12 years, I would do things completely differently. My name is Awakened, and I've released music on Ophelia, Heaven Sent, Seeking Blue, Enhanced, and more. I've released official remixes for Seven Lions, Jason Ross, Illenium, Tritonal, and more. And over the last 6 years, I have mentored dozens of producers through this same journey, watching them go from struggling to release a single track, to releasing music on their dream labels, and landing official remixes for artists that they used to idolize. And the biggest thing I've learned from teaching is that most producers waste years on the wrong stuff. They grind for years and years on stuff that barely moves the needle, and skip the stuff that decides whether a song actually sounds professional. So in this video, I'm going to give you the exact learning path I would use if I could start over, in the exact order that actually matters, so you can skip the mistakes I made and get to a professional quality way faster. Let's get into it. Phase 1, and probably the single most important thing you can learn to do well, is songwriting. Not sound design, not mixing, not any of the other stuff that most producers obsess over. And the biggest mistake I made here, the one that genuinely slowed me down for years, was not learning basic music theory. I'm talking scales, major chord versus minor chord, triads, the really simple fundamental stuff. I avoided learning the fundamentals of music theory for one simple reason. I heard the people I look up to like Porter Robinson and Deadmau5 say in interviews that they didn't know anything about music theory when they started. So I figured, great, I don't need to learn it either. And this caused me to put off learning it for almost 8 or 9 years. I'm not exaggerating. I put off learning this stuff for almost a decade. A couple years ago, I finally sat down and actually took the time to learn this stuff. You want to know how long it took me to get a good grasp on scales, chords, triads, and stuff like that? A few months. That's it. I dodged this for almost a decade, and it took me a few months to learn. After I learned this stuff, everything changed. Once I understood the fundamentals, I could actually put my hands on a piano and play chords comfortably. This opened up an entirely new avenue of creativity for me. I could write things that I never would have written before because I finally understood what I was doing, instead of just guessing and clicking notes or editing MIDI clips from a pack until something sounded good. The thing that forced my hand was starting my new artist project, New Light. Most of that music is in the genre of melodic house. That style is really built around simplicity and good songwriting. You can't hide behind the excitement and intricacy of the layering and production like you sometimes can in melodic bass. The writing really has to carry the track on its own. And the moment that the writing really had to stand on its own, the music theory that I had been avoiding for almost a decade became the thing that mattered most. So, if you are early in your journey, make this your #1 priority. Learn enough theory to write an interesting chord progression from scratch, voice those chords in a way that actually sounds good, and move from an intro to a verse, to a chorus, to a build, to a drop, while keeping things musically interesting the whole time. That foundation will make everything after this easier. So phase 2 is sound selection, and this is the second most important thing in music production, second only to writing. The mistake here is huge, and almost everybody, myself included, makes it. People think the reason that their stuff doesn't sound professional is because they lack sound design skills. And by sound design, I mean building sounds from scratch inside of a synth. So they go down that rabbit hole for months or even years trying to learn how to make sounds from scratch, convinced that that is the missing piece in their production. Let me tell you from personal experience, it is not. After producing for almost 12 years, I can tell you with complete confidence that you do not need to make sounds from scratch. Everyone is using presets, samples, and loops, even the pros. Are there people out there making everything from scratch like AU5? Absolutely. Does that mean that we all need to do the same thing? No. Whether you made a sound from scratch or pulled it out of a preset pack, it does not matter. How you use the sound is what matters. I wasted years of my life thinking that any given sound just needed more tweaking or more processing and then it would sound sick. These days, the majority of my sounds have little to no processing on them because I finally learned the real skill, which is not designing sounds, but rather selecting them. If a sound is not interesting or powerful, the best and certainly easiest move most of the time is not to process it more, it's to just go find a better sound. So how do you actually find great sounds? Well, Splice is a great place to start. Honestly, I didn't even use it for the first few years I was making music. Beyond that, tons of artists you look up to and listen to now have their own Patreons where they're making their own custom preset and sample packs. So find artists who make the kind of music you want to make and go grab their packs. People like Blank, AU5, Virtual Riot, Aaron Shirk, Starseed, just to name a few. They all put out amazing samples and presets you can buy. There are also great sample companies out there like Sample Magic or Excellent, which is XLNT. For presets, it's basically the same idea. You can always Google something like Illenium preset packs and just sort of browse through the best options. Something else you can do if you have a Splice membership is just go on there and search by specific subgenre, and then you can look through Serum, Silent, etc. and find presets that are working for that specific synth. If I had spent more of my early years trying to find high-quality, genre-specific sample packs and presets rather than trying to make everything from scratch myself, I would have saved an unbelievable number of hours and headaches. And of course, this is not to say you should never learn sound design. This is not to say you should never make sounds from scratch. This is simply me telling you that sound design itself is very overrated and sound selection is very underrated. Phase 3 is layering, and this is where having a combination of good sounds starts to turn into an actual track. The mistake here is that people tend to choose their layers more or less at random. They don't really understand how to fit multiple layers together so that they all sound cohesive together. So they end up stacking 3, 4, 5 layers that all sound basically the same. Or they pick a bunch of sounds, all of which are drenched in reverb. Or they choose 4 wide sounds when 1 mono sound and 1 wide sound would have worked way better. And then after all this, they wonder why their mix feels cluttered and weak and muddy. The fix is one simple question that you ask yourself about every single sound and layer you choose. What is the job of this sound? What is its purpose? Let me give you an example. Say you are building a bass and you have a few layers. Does this layer need to fill in the low end in the mono between 70 and 200 hertz? Or is its job to fill up the stereo image out in the width in the high frequencies? Does this layer need a lot of reverb so it feels spacey and far away? Or do you want it up close, right in your face? Every layer should have a clear, deliberate job, and whether you know the job, you know whether that sound fits or not. You stop stacking sounds at random and start assigning roles. And this is where I'll also mention reverb, because stacking too much reverb was a mistake that I just made for years. I see most producers making this exact same mistake. Reverb tends to sound really good when you're just listening to a single sound, so people tend to pile it on everything. The problem is when you do that, your whole mix just turns into a big muddy cloud and everything just feels washed out. Nothing has any definition. If a layer's job is to feel bright, present, or upfront, it probably doesn't need much reverb, maybe none at all. Be very intentional with what you put reverb on. That one habit will clean up your tracks more than you could ever expect. Phase 4 is arrangement, which is all about keeping the song interesting from section to section so that the listener never gets bored. The mistake I see constantly is a producer will come up with a great chord progression and an awesome melody, and then just loop it over and over and over again with no variety. The core idea is good, but it never goes anywhere, so the listener just checks out. The framework I use is super simple. Every 8 bars, add something minor to create a sense of variety, and every 16 bars, do something noticeably different. This depends on whether or not you're working in half-time or full-time. So if you're working at 75 BPM, for example, instead of 150 BPM, the rule would be 4 bars and 8 bars rather than 8 bars and 16 bars. Typically, I'm working in the 128 to 150 BPM range, and so for me, it's every 8 bars and every 16 bars. This cadence keeps your song evolving, so it feels like the story is always changing and the story plot is going somewhere. And here's the part that will save you a ton of time, something I wish I knew years ago. A lot of producers think when you go from your verse into your chorus that you need a completely new chord progression. The truth is, you honestly don't. In order to keep things interesting, in order to make it feel like the story is evolving, all you really need to do is just change the voicing of your chords a little bit when you move from your verse into your chorus. Take the top note and just add a new melody on there. That's often more than enough musically to create a sense of variety for the listener. On top of that, swapping the main instrument that is expressing these chords makes a massive difference. So for example, maybe through your verse, your piano chords are heavily leading the charge in terms of songwriting. When you hit the chorus, something you might do is get rid of those piano chords, and instead you have chord plucks, a nice bass, and maybe some strings on top of that. Again, creating a slight variety with that top melody on your chords so that it feels like we're moving into a different part of the songwriting. When you do this effectively, you have basically the same chords, but a completely different feeling. It feels very fresh and exciting for the listener. It feels like the story of the song is going somewhere, and you didn't have to rewrite an entire chord progression to get there. Hey, quick 30-second pause, and then we'll get back to the video. I put together a free 1-page roadmap PDF of everything I cover in this video. The 6 phases in order, the mistake to avoid in each one, and what to do instead. Links in the description below. It's completely free. Go grab it before you forget. All right, back to the video. Phase 5 is mixing and EQing, and in my experience, this is one of the single biggest unlocks for most producers. It is often the difference between something that sounds super novice versus something that sounds completely polished and professional. One of the big mistakes that a lot of producers make is that they just don't mix or EQ at all. They just stack layer after layer on top of one another and never stop to think how the mix actually sounds. And what they usually end up with is just a frequency nightmare. Everything is fighting everything else, so the result is that you can't really hear anything, the whole mix just sounds muddy, and everything is often just completely clipped. It's basically just a big frequency soup, but it's a really bad and burnt frequency soup. The second mistake here is thinking that you need some type of complex processing in order to fix this problem. Most producers think, okay, this doesn't sound right, I need an OTT, or I need compression. They go and they grab some complicated tool that's probably never going to be the actual solve to their problem. The reality is, taking a song from muddy or or thin or clipped to punchy, clean, and professional is often just two simple things: volume and EQ. It often really is that simple, turning the volume of different tracks up or down and using an EQ to carve space out of one sound to make room for another. If you want the one EQ trick to learn first, the one that's going to buy you the most space in your mix the fastest, it is cleaning up your low end, specifically below like 350 Hertz. In EDM, that frequency area gets muddy unbelievably fast. The majority of sounds we use are very harmonically rich, and most of them have a ton of reverb, so stuff just stacks up in that area really quickly. So if a sound doesn't need frequency down in that area, don't be afraid to low cut it all the way up to 350, maybe even 500 Hertz. And if there's a bunch of elements that overlap in that area, say re-bass, sub-bass, pads, pianos, choose the sounds that have the cleanest signal down in the low end, meaning no reverb at all, and then low cut a ton of low end away from the other layers. This one move alone will dramatically clean up your mix. And I want to be really clear about how much this matters. I've mentored tons of producers at this point. When people send me their music for feedback for the first time, they often think their problem is some type of sound design issue, or maybe they need to learn how to use compressors better, or their master chain just kind of sucks. The vast majority of the time, none of those things are the problem. In almost every case, the real problem is mixing and EQing. Do not underestimate their importance. A good example is my student Jesus, who goes by Neol Mavi. When he came to me, he was already a great songwriter, but he didn't have that good of a grasp on layering, mixing, or arrangement. And of all of those, mixing and EQing were by far the biggest unlock for him. Once that clicked for him, everything came together. He released his first ever melodic bass track called The Arrival, and it already has almost 250,000 streams. Phase 6 is mastering, and the most important thing I can tell you about it is that it comes last. It doesn't just come last in your workflow, it's last on the list of things you should learn in order. So the mistake most people make here is that they're mastering their stuff way too early. I was mixing into a master chain and worrying about the overall master way too early in my production journey. I was obsessing over limiters, loudness, LUFS, stuff like that. Honestly, I had no business worrying about any of that stuff yet. Mastering is just a complete waste of your time until you can do everything else well. If your writing, sound selection, layering, mixing, arrangement, or EQing aren't solid yet, a good master is not going to save the track. It's just an attempt to polish problems you haven't even solved yet. One small tangent on loudness, because this trips people up all the time. You'll hear people say, oh, you should export your song at -14 LUFS because it's optimal for Spotify or whatever. Just ignore that. You do want your music to be as loud as possible while still preserving dynamic range and avoiding clipping and distortion. But here's the thing that I wish somebody had told me years ago. If your mix isn't super solid and then you try to smash it into a master chain, you'll never actually be able to fix anything because everything's just smashed into a limiter, all the volumes are off balance, and you can't actually hear what's happening in the mix at that point. Get a clean, powerful, and punchy pre-master mix, and then worry about putting a master chain on there and making it loud. So how do you know if your mix is actually ready to start thinking about mastering it? So there's two super reliable ways that I've found. One is getting really critical feedback from somebody who knows exactly what they're talking about, somebody that's been mixing and producing songs for 10 plus years. Of course, I happen to be that person, but there's lots of other people in the industry who can do that. The other is learning to be as critical and objective about your own music as possible, referencing it against the professional music you want it to sound like, using a handful of really important techniques. I cover most of those techniques in a recent mixing video that I just uploaded to YouTube, so check that out. I want to give you one more student example here because this sort of shows the whole roadmap in working order. My student Tark came to me with rough patches in most of these areas. The overall quality of his stuff just wasn't quite there yet. I'd say the two biggest areas of opportunity that we worked on were sound selection and mixing and EQing. We worked through these rough patches phase by phase, and he has grown into an incredible multi-genre producer who barely ever asks for my help anymore. He's also now won 4 remix contests, he's working with bigger and better collaborators, and he's releasing professional quality music consistently that he feels super proud of. One of the biggest struggles he had before he came to me was he just never quite felt like his music was done. He never really knew if he could call it a finished product. Now he can confidently do that over and over again. So that's the order: songwriting, sound selection, layering, arrangement, mixing, EQing, and master. Learn it in that order and you'll skip years of spinning your wheels. And the gear you need to do all of this is actually way simpler than a lot of people might think. The entire list I might suggest is really short. You need a DAW, I use Ableton. You need a synth, I use Serum. I'd recommend a MIDI keyboard. The brand doesn't really matter as long as it's like 49 key or above. You want a simple 2-in, 2-out interface like a Scarlett or a Volt, and you really want a decent pair of studio headphones. Nice speakers are fun, and I'd recommend them if you have the budget, but they're totally optional. You don't need to go spend $5,000 on plugins. You don't need outboard gear and analog gear. That's the entire list of stuff you need to make professional quality music. So I'll be straight with you about how how I learned and what it ended up doing for me. I used to spend months, honestly sometimes 2 or 3 years, finishing a single song. So many of my songs used to get to version 200 plus before I was actually done with it. I would just spin my wheels forever, not knowing what was wrong, what needed to be fixed, how to fix it, or even in what order. It honestly drove me insane. These days, the final version of a song that I'm releasing is never more than version like 10 to 15. The main thing that changed, of course, was experience, but also that I finally figured out what to work on and in what order. That gap from needing 200 plus versions to finish a song down to like 10 was never about talent, and it was never about expensive plugins. It was about a learning order that nobody ever handed me. Now you have it. So if you only take one thing away from this video, take this. The gap between your music and the artists that you look up to comes down way more to what you learn and in what order than it does on gear or expensive plugins. I spent years learning in the wrong order and focusing on the wrong stuff, and the day that I started to fix that was the day that everything really started to click. Now you have the learning order that I wish somebody had given me. And if you're like me and Illenium was one of the artists that made you want to start producing music in the first place, the perfect next step after watching this video is to go check out the full breakdown that I did creating a song that sounds just like one of his. I go through the chords, the sound selection, the mix, and everything else. That video just popped up on this end screen. Click it, follow along, go make something dope, and I'll see you there.